AskReddit by Octopuszilla. People who work in morgues or with the dead, what is the creepiest thing you've witnessed? Deleted. I so feel this. My son passed the 2nd of August. I got his dirty water the hospital. I am never washing it. Smells just like him. If someone's been down for more than a day or two, they'll start decomposing from the inside out. If the room is quiet enough, you can hear lots of gurgling and rumbling as the gases and fluids are moving around inside. And then you move them and they groan as the residual air in their lungs is forced out past their vocal cords. True blave. I work with a lot of hospice patients, so death is a common occurrence in my field. One night when one of my patients had literally just passed, the phone rang. It was the daughter hundreds of miles away who had never checked in on mom the whole time she was in my care. She sounded panicked and asked if mom was okay. That timing always weirded me out because it really seemed like she somehow knew something happened with her mom, who near the end was confused and constantly insisted she needed to find that daughter. I remember reading an AskReddit post where many people shared anecdotes of people knowing they were about to die, or loved ones sensing that something had happened. My wife is a mortician. She's had quite a lot of wacky experiences. This is more funny than creepy, but once she was trying to break up the rigor mortis in a dissident's hip by flexing the entire leg up. Her grip slipped and the leg swung down, the heel cracking her right in the face, resulting in a black eye. She had to explain to people that she's not in an abusive relationship, she just got kicked in the face by a dead guy. I'm not being abused. I got this from a dead guy. So, were you being abused? I watched 2 young children's corpses fry with electricity. We responded to an electrocution. A fault caused electricity to be traveling down the stabilizing cables of the electrical pole. A little kid touched that cable and got shocked, causing his hand to grasp tighter. His little buddy must have seen it and grabbed him. By the time we got there they were both dead, but still electrified. We couldn't safely approach until the electricity department cut the power. So we sat there and watched these 2 little bodies twitch and spark. Was like a horror movie. That's absolutely tragic. Here locally we had a whole team of M's get killed when someone stepped in an electrified ditch water while they all carried the patient. If I recall, the patient was a drunk driver and was fighting them. 4 or 5 people died including the driver. It was awful. My fiancée died 6 days before our wedding. That morning I tried to wake her up, and when I noticed she wasn't responding I attempted to find a pulse and perform CPR. When I was doing CPR she started wheezing, but it was only me pushing the air from her lungs. When I checked for a pulse I accidentally had my thumb on her neck and felt my own pulse, and I had a glimmer of hope that I had somehow managed to revive her, even though in hindsight, it was obvious she had passed on already, only to have my heart ripped out again in an instant when she wasn't moving or breathing. I had only performed CPR in training courses but never on a person, and I had absolutely no idea what to expect when pressing on someone's chest that hard. It's only been 3 months and no answers as to how she died, but now every time I wheeze, post-COVID asthmatic, the PTSD strikes and I relive the moment of finding my low. This is terrible, I'm so sorry. People who had been on blood thinner medication before they died can make for a odd scene. Saw a guy that had died looking out of his window, so he was discovered with his head on the windowsill and there was a thick column of jellied blood from his nose to the floor. It was a bit freaky. Without the blood jelly, that's kind of a sweet, picturesque way to die. Worked at a mortuary for a few years. We have methods to keep the jaw shut for viewing, otherwise it would gap open due to the angle of the head and neck. During a viewing the device failed and this gentleman's mouth literally popped open. The lead embalmer was not on site, so I did my best. Ushered the family out of the room and superglued his mouth shut, but he didn't have teeth and supergluing just his lips did not work. It looked as if he was attempting to scream. I had to call in one of our other mortuaries in town, and that embalmer used a giant needle and thread to sew his mouth shut from under his chin to his palate. Wow, the things we take for granted at viewings. There must be a ton of work to prep and maintain behind the scenes. Here is a funny story from my grandma. She used to work in an ER in Puerto Rico. Some guy had passed away, and so the doctor came up to her and asked her to prepare the body to go to the morgue. So, she got some sheets and started to wrap this guy up. As she crossed his legs, suddenly his penis became fully erect and was straight up. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but it forced her to have to redo the sheets. So as she uncrossed his legs, the penis went down. So she was like, alright, let's get this over with. Then she crossed them again, and lo and behold, the penis went straight back up. Tried one more time and then she got freaked out and went back to the doctor. Obviously he found this hilarious as the guy apparently had a prosthetic in his penis. Die Hard. The creepiest thing is the fucking curtain of flies and maggots blanketing the floor of an apartment where a woman had been decomposing in the hot late August early September sun for 3 weeks before she was discovered. I thought it was dark in that apartment, but there were simply that many flies caught in the glass covering the light bulbs. On the ceiling. The floor lamp. The stovetop light. Every single light was covered in flies. The windows were dark with flies. Dead flies, and even more flies than that on the window panes. It was a horror movie. She was melted into the couch. When we tried to pick her up, her spine just fell outside of the rest of her body and she ended up in pieces. I guess it's less creepy and more skin crawling. But I hate flies and maggots. Freshly dead, I can deal with. Decomp in and of itself is fine. But the sight of those flies was just... There is no amount of money you could pay me to do anything other than erect a safety structure around the property and incinerate it wholesale. One of the dissident's grandsons faked a breakdown over the casket. He stole all her jewelry. Didn't take long to figure out and a large brawl broke out. Jewelry was retrieved. 2 weeks later grandson turns up needing to be processed and buried. Creepy as hell. Edit for eating shoots and leaves. IYKYK. Damn. If only he could have paid off that debt collector. Sometimes when people have died, and we turn them over to clean and dress them, they still have air in their lungs and will make grunting noises when moved. Scared the crap out of me the first time I experienced it. My grandpa had a related experience in Vietnam. He was helping wash and prepare bodies for transport home under the direction of the coroner, who had warned them about the bodies making noises when moved. After a bit, Grandpa asked the coroner how the body he was washing could cry. The coroner repeated the lecture about air being pushed out and Grandpa said that he got that part, but how did that form tears? He said things got very busy after that. Grandpa's assigned corpse was not actually dead, just suffering a lot of blood loss and very cold. Dude got 5 liters of blood, some of it from my grandpa, and then he flew home to spend the rest of the war recovering. I delivered pizza to a crematorium. Dude set down his pizza on a cardboard coffin to get money and I couldn't stop looking at the box on the conveyor leading into the crematorium chamber. I pointed out, isn't that a little disrespectful? The dude came back and simply said, oh, don't worry about him, he won't mind. It was probably comforting for his ghost, knowing he is going through the same process that pizza goes through every day. I worked at a funeral home for quite a while. When I first started, about a month in, I was working a holiday weekend. Only people working were the transport guys and AMP, me. They came to drop off a body and AMP, went right back out. I thought they were still there and needed to ask a question. I walked into the embalming area and AMP. This dude was sitting up on the gurney looking right at me when I opened the door and it literally made me pee a little in fright. Turns out the transport guys picked up the body from an area hospital. He'd passed away while in a slightly reclining position and AMP rigor had set in. They couldn't flatten him out. Still the scariest moment in my career, even if I got a laugh out of it later. You know they bolted like that on purpose. Not necessarily the creepiest thing, but the funeral home I worked for liked to embalm as soon as possible after death. I had embalmed a man that was dead for less than 30 minutes an hour. He was still warm and rigor had not set in yet. I kinda just held his hand for a minute before I got started. Edit. Wow, I'm really happy this comment blew up. It really shows that compassion isn't dead. Thank you. When my wife passed away suddenly, I was sitting with her in the ER, and when I came back in, they had her swaddled, like an infant. I managed to get her hand out, and was holding her hand thinking that as long as I was holding it, it wouldn't get cold. Sometimes a fresh corpse will get shaky limbs. Make it a bitch to bag up in a hurry. I'm not dead. What? I'm not dead. He says he's not dead. Attended a suspected fire once where we could smell smoke but couldn't locate the fire. Eventually located it, and when we entered the house there was an old woman slumped over on the floor. Tried to turn her over but couldn't. Turned out that she had been laid on one of the old bar type heaters, and because the heat was not allowed to escape, it had burnt a hole through the floorboards and the heater fell through the hole. However, when she was laid on it, her body fat started to melt and run into the floorboards. Then when the heater fell through, she cooled. By the time we got there, she was one with the floor. Two of us to get shovels under her to roll her over. It was years before I could eat smoky bacon flavor crisps again. This is gruesome. I initiated compressions on my patient when she unexpectedly coded. About halfway through my first round, the patient pinked up, eyes opened, turned her head and groaned. I stopped, and so did she. Turned grey and unresponsive, so I started compressions again. She woke up again, and I realized that compressions were providing adequate perfusion to her brain, so she'd wake up, but her heart wasn't doing anything. I had to continue compressions and shock my patient, who was awake, groaning, and alert enough to know what was happening. I've coded countless patients without a problem, but this event gave me nightmares for some time. I've had this happen to me too. Crazy stuff. I think the docs called it compression-induced consciousness. Every time we'd start compressions, he'd gain responsiveness, say it hurt and say stop, but every time we paused after he became responsive, we'd lose pulses again. You have smelled nothing until you have smelled the farts of the dead. Former set. Advanced cancer has a certain smell as well. I don't work in a morgue or with the dead, but I unexpectedly lost both my mom in 2020 and my closest sister in 2022. When my mom passed, my sister was the first to discover her. By the time I got to the house, EMTs had tried to revive her and failed, and she was still wearing a plastic mask of some kind on in her mouth that some emergency tubing had been attached to. We called a priest for final rites, Catholic family, and my uncle and I had to pick her up from the floor to get her on her bed. We almost slipped, and I remember that her head kind of whipped back and her teeth made this awful, dull clacking sound against the plastic aperture of the mask. It simultaneously creeped me out and made me even sadder that she had to undergo such indignities in death. With my sister, I was the one to discover that she died in her sleep, same house. I didn't have a key to the door and I'm a big guy and couldn't get through her bedroom window. She wasn't responding to my yells, so I grabbed a brick from the little flower bed out front and dropped it through the window and onto her leg. It twitched a little bit, which gave me a moment's hope, but nothing else happened, and it was discovered when the EMTs got there that she'd been gone for hours. I can still see it in my mind's eye, that twitch. My first job was at a cemetery. We had a common burial. Someone who cannot afford a casket or vault, they are provided a wood frame and cardboard casket. We dug the hole the night before. It rained heavily that night. The next day after the ceremony, we lowered the casket into the water-filled hole. It just floated on top. So, we used a backhoe bucket to push it down. The casket fell apart and the body slid out and floated. We pushed her down and filled the hole. I protested, but was told this is how things were done. I still feel bad about it. I actually really like the idea of being buried in the ground. I think it's weird to be in a coffin. Returning to the soil is natural. I don't think there is anything wrong with what happened. Actually, if it were my body, I would think this situation was kind of funny. Maybe she was a jokester and she wanted one last laugh. When we spread my uncle's ashes, a huge gust of wind blew ash into his little brother's mouth, now an adult, and he was spitting, crying, and laughing because he had messed with his little brother his whole life, and we knew his big bro was getting one last prank in. Rotated though the forensic path lab during medical school. One ended up seeing and participating in the autopsy of a high school classmate. It was completely without knowing at the time. Years later, no similar resemblance, but then I saw posts on Facebook about him later that day, and it put me in the worst funk for a solid week or two. All these posts about him, and there I was with his brain in my hands. Yeah, when I started working as an undertaker, the very first day I had to deal with the body of someone I went to school with 2 years earlier. He was a bully and an asshole, but Jesus, to die in a stupid bike accident at 18. I had his medical bracelet for many years. There, but for the grace of God. My creepiest moment was when I was in the morgue by myself at 4 AM. I was using the lift to put a body into a crypt. It had reached roughly eye level when the power went out. It is now pitch dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Then all the fans died, and all I could hear was the crinkling of body bags. That's when I started to hear disembodied voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying or where they were coming from. The power comes back a few moments later on and I move on with my night. Turns out the voices were just the automated "the power has gone out," switching to generate a power message. Haha. I'd straight up shit myself. My buddy worked at a crematorium, and after burning the bodies they would have to rake out the stuff that doesn't burn, like hip replacements, stuff like that. I can't for the life of me remember what they did. Gold fillings, removed before or after? Pacemakers were removed before burning, I'm pretty sure.